I was eating alone the night she sat down at my table. Not exactly a shocker for me. Most of my evenings end up exactly that way. A corner booth at the old lighthouse. This little coastal cafe. A plate of something hot. And the kind of quiet that doesn't ask a single thing from you. I'd been going there every single Wednesday for 4 years. Same booth, same order. The waitress Clara stopped pretending to ask what I wanted about 6 months in and just started bringing my coffee the second I cleared the door. The cafe always smelled like old chicory, burnt toast, and the damp salt air pushing in from the harbor just 50 yards down the road. There's this weirdly comfortable thing about a place that knows you well enough to just leave you alone. My name is Julian Hayes. I'm 34 years old. I work out of a small, dusty shop in the historic district as an antique watch restorer. Chronographs, century-old pocket watches, complicated pendulum clocks, you name it. My workbench is usually cluttered with tiny glass jars, specialized tweezers, and brass gears so small you could fit a dozen of them on the tip of your thumb. My whole life is about making sure microscopic gears line up perfectly. I fix worn pivots, straighten bent teeth, and basically bring back to life things that time gave up on. It's the kind of work that demands absolute precision, and man, it punishes you for making assumptions. You look through a jeweler's loupe for 8 hours a day, and your world shrinks down to a 2-inch circle of steel and ruby bearings. You don't guess where a hairspring sits. You have to know. And I guess that suited me just fine, because I've never been the type to assume things will just work out. I learned pretty early on that the difference between a watch ticking perfectly and completely locking up is usually just one tiny speck of dust, or some microscopic tooth that someone decided wasn't worth checking. If you force a crown when a gear is jammed, the whole thing shears off and you're left with a handful of useless metal scrap. I applied that to most of my life, honestly. Not just the workshop. I checked things. I was careful. I didn't leave a lot to chance. I kept my circle small, my bills paid early, and my expectations ground level, which is probably why what happened that Wednesday in November caught me so completely off guard. I was just about to lift my coffee cup when I heard the scrape of the heavy wooden chair across from me. It was that loud, jarring sound that completely cuts through the low murmur of a quiet diner. I looked up, totally expecting Clara with a glass of water or a refill. It wasn't Clara. She was maybe 28, 29. Dark hair pulled back, but in a way that kind of suggested it had started the morning looking a lot neater than it did right now. A few loose strands were framing her face, damp from the mist outside. She had this heavy wool coat over what looked like sharp office clothes. A nice blouse, slacks, the kind of outfit that told you she hadn't even stopped by her house before coming here. She looked beautiful, but in a completely exhausted, real-world sort of way. But she wasn't alone. Right by her side, walking with this incredibly calm, slow stride, was a massive golden retriever. The dog didn't make a sound. It just slipped right under the table, curled up at her feet, and let out this long, heavy sigh before resting its chin on its paws. His fur was a little damp too, smelling faintly of the autumn rain. And then she just sat down. Didn't ask, didn't hesitate. She just settled into the booth right across from me like we'd had reservations for weeks. I set my cup down, slowly, making sure it landed perfectly in the center of the little ceramic saucer so I wouldn't spill a drop. She looked at me for a second, and it wasn't that look strangers give you when they realize they messed up and are about to apologize and awkwardly leave. It was the look of someone who had been building up the nerve to do something for a really long time, and finally just closed their eyes and jumped. I could see her fingers tightly gripping the strap of her leather bag, her knuckles turning a little white. Then she said, "I think you know why I'm here." I had absolutely no clue why she was there. I had never seen this woman before in my entire life. I don't forget faces, especially not in a town this small. I cleared my throat and said, "I don't think we've met." She blinked. Something shifted in her eyes. That icy composure she'd walked in with cracked just a tiny bit at the edges. She looked down at the table, then down at the golden retriever, and then right back up at me. "You're Julian Hayes." "I am. You own the Hayes Horology shop over on the old square." "Yeah, that's me." I kept my voice as level as I could. "Who are you?" She let out this breath. It wasn't exactly relief. It felt more like someone releasing a valve on steam that had been building up inside them for months. Under the table, the dog shifted slightly, pressing against her leg. I noticed how her hand instantly went down to stroke his head. It was this subconscious, synchronized thing. The dog felt her tension, and she used the dog to steady her own heart rate. It's wild how dogs do that, you know. Just reading the room without a word. They have this built-in radar for human static. "My name is Elena," she said, and her voice was finally losing that little tremor. "My brother is Elias. He used to be your apprentice about 2 years ago." I knew that name. Of course I did. Elias was this brilliant, incredibly talented kid. But man, he was reckless. He had the hands of a surgeon but the patience of a stray cat. About 6 months into his time with me, he was working on an 18th century Swiss tourbillon, a masterpiece. He got impatient, applied the wrong amount of torque to the mainspring, and the whole mechanism basically shattered inside the casing. It sounded like a tiny violent gunshot inside a steel cage. It took me 3 months of custom machining to fix that mistake, and it nearly bankrupted my shop. My old master, who still owned the deed back then, fired him on the spot. I didn't stop it. I couldn't. But I was there. I watched him pack his wooden toolbox with his head down. I waited for her to go on. "He lost his job," Elena said, her eyes locked onto mine. "And because of the way he left, no other high-end shop in the city would touch him. He lost his confidence. He spent 8 months sitting in his apartment, completely broken, thinking he ruined his life over one bad afternoon." She paused, her hand still rhythmically petting the dog under the table. "And I spent a really, really long time being angry about it. Angry at your shop, angry at the old owner, angry at you, just furious at how one mistake could cancel out a kid's entire future." "I'm sorry," I said, leaning back a bit. "What happened to Elias? It was a tragedy for the shop, too. But the decision to let him go, I know," she interrupted. "I know you didn't make the call. That pulled me up short. Then why are you here?" She reached into her leather bag and pulled out this old, slightly crinkled manila envelope. She laid it right between us on the wooden table. She didn't slam it down, she placed it carefully, the way you handle something incredibly fragile. Like a historical document that could turn to dust if you handled it too rough. "Because 6 months after Elias was fired," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "someone sent a letter to the 3 biggest watchmaking firms in the state. It didn't come from the shop's official mail. It didn't come from the owner. It came from you." She tapped the envelope. An unsolicited personal reference letter. And it said that Elias was a visionary young watchmaker who made a single structural error due to youth, but that his innate understanding of mechanics was something no school could ever teach. It said whoever hired him would be securing the future of their company. I looked down at the envelope. I remembered writing that. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was alone in the shop cleaning up Elias's old workbench, and I found his notebook tucked behind some old technical manuals. It was full of these hand-drawn sketches of entirely new escapement designs. They were brilliant. Untrained, sure, but genius. He was trying to solve friction problems that guys with PhDs were still scratching their heads over. And it just felt wrong to let a kid's gift rust away in a dark apartment because of one bad day. I didn't tell the old owner. I didn't tell anyone. I just stamped the letters and dropped them in the blue mailbox down the street. "He got hired a month later," Elena said, and this massive wave of softness finally took over her face. "At a luxury brand's restoration hub. He's their assistant director of design now. He's thriving." She looked down, a bit embarrassed. "He has no idea I'm here. He'd probably die of mortification if he knew." I looked from the envelope back to her. "So, why are you here?" She looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like a whole minute. The hum of the diner's old refrigerator seemed to get louder in the silence. "Because I spent 2 years carrying around a metric ton of resentment toward you and your place. And then I found out what you did." Elias accidentally left the letter on the kitchen counter when he visited last month. And I realized I couldn't just live with that. I needed to look you in the eye and say thank you. An email felt cheap. I found out you come here on Wednesdays and, well, I actually sat in my car for 40 minutes tonight trying to build up the courage to walk through that door. She let out a tiny, self-deprecating laugh. I almost put the car in reverse and left. I watched her sitting there. Her coat was still half on, her bag still looped over her shoulder, like she was ready to bolt if I reacted badly. She had driven all the way out here, fought her own anxiety in a cold parking lot, walked in and bared her soul to a guy she thought she hated. That takes a hell of a lot more nerve than most people give themselves credit for. You didn't have to do that, I told her. I know, she said, but I needed to. There's a massive difference between those two things, and she clearly understood it. I asked her if she wanted some coffee. She looked a little startled, like she figured the conversation was over, but then she smiled and nodded. I flagged down Clara. Clara looked at the dog, looked at Elena, raised a single judgmental eyebrow at me, but didn't say a word. She just brought over a fresh pot and 2 mugs. Clara was an expert at knowing exactly when to shut up. We stayed there for a long time. I asked about Elias, not out of politeness, but because I honestly wanted to know how the story ended. She told me everything. He was 24 now, living near the city, and he'd just been given his first independent project to restore a 1920s marine chronometer. She spoke about him the way people talk about someone they used to stay up late worrying about, and are still getting used to the fact that they don't have to worry anymore. That relief is a heavy thing to carry, but it's light when you finally share it. I asked her what she did for a living. Historical architectural restoration, she said, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug. For the city, mostly dealing with old facades, structurally compromised landmarks, making sure the old brickwork doesn't crumble into the street. She looked at me sideways, which means we've probably been in the exact same municipal oversight meetings and never even realized it. I thought about it. She was completely right. The city council always brought in local artisans when they were preserving old clocks or public buildings. I'd been to 3 of those town halls in the last year. I couldn't place her face, which either meant we just missed each other or I was paying way less attention to my surroundings than I like to think. I usually sit in the back row, sketching gear teeth on the back of the agenda packet, completely checked out. Small world, I said. Yeah, apparently. She watched the dog, who was now dead to the world, under the table. His paws were twitching slightly, probably chasing phantom rabbits in his sleep. Look, I'm sorry for just bursting in on your dinner. I know it's incredibly weird. It is weird, I admitted, but honestly, it's not a bad kind of weird. She smirked, a little spark in her eyes. You're being awfully relaxed about a total stranger hijacking your booth. I grinned. Hey, I checked the structural integrity of this wooden bench before I sat down. It can easily support 2 people and a 70-pound golden retriever. We're perfectly safe. She laughed. It was this sudden, loud, totally unforced laugh that completely changed her face. It washed away all that professional stiffness she'd walked in with. I definitely took note of that. She left about 20 minutes later. She bundled her coat back up, woke up Barnaby, who gave me this sleepy, polite nod of his own, and said it was really good to meet me. For real this time. I told her the same. I watched her walk out into the chilly November rain, her red taillights disappearing down the dark coastal road, and then I just sat there staring at the manila envelope on the table. Inside was the copy of my letter. She'd printed it out. She'd been carrying it around. I sat with that thought for a while, trying to figure out where to file it in my brain. It didn't fit into any of my usual neat categories. Clara materialized out of nowhere with the check. Without looking up from her pad, she muttered, "She was pretty." "Yeah," I said. "She was." "You didn't get her number." "No, I didn't." Clara just shook her head, conveying a level of pure, unadulterated disappointment that no words could ever match, and walked away. I stayed in that booth for another 15 minutes, thinking about the specific kind of idiot it takes to let a perfect moment slide right past you without doing a damn thing about it. I didn't see her again for 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks were surprisingly loud. Every time the bell above my shop door chimed, my head snapped up way too fast. I found myself looking out the front window at the rainy street, wondering if she was working on one of the historical brick buildings down the block. And then, there she was. It was a city planning committee meeting regarding the restoration of the old 19th century clock tower on the north side of town. The place was packed with local contractors and bored civil servants. She was sitting at the far end of the long conference table, buried under a mountain of blueprints, structural reports, and a paper cup of cheap vending machine coffee that looked like it tasted like battery acid. She was aggressively scribbling notes in the margins of a document, clicking her pen over and over again in a rhythm that told me she was desperately trying to stop herself from yelling at someone out loud. Barnaby was right there, of course, tucked neatly under her chair like a furry, golden footrest, completely indifferent to local politics. She happened to glance up and caught my eye. She went totally still for a second. Her pen stopped clicking. Then she gave me this little nod. Very polite, completely professional. The kind of nod that says, "I acknowledge your existence in this room and I will address it at an appropriate time." I nodded back. The meeting was a total train wreck. It dragged on for 2 hours. There was this brutal disagreement about whether to replace or reinforce the old iron framework on the east face. Two board members spent 40 minutes talking over each other while a third guy was aggressively drawing red lines on a whiteboard like a madman. It was the kind of bureaucracy that makes you want to pull your teeth out with pliers. During the absolute worst of it, when someone started arguing about the historic validity of galvanized screws, I caught Elena's eye across the room. She pressed her lips together, making this face that wasn't quite a smile, but carried a hilarious amount of shared exhaustion. Once the meeting finally broke up, I caught up with her in the hallway. The crowd was thinning out, people complaining about the lack of pastries. "That ironwork debate," I said, falling into step beside her. "Every single time," she groaned, slinging her heavy bag over her shoulder. "Same two guys, same exact argument, just a slightly different building. Does it ever get resolved?" "Eventually. Usually when one of them goes on vacation or gets tired of hearing his own voice." I laughed, and she did too. Just a little quick burst, before looking up at me with this unreadable expression. Like she was weighing an option in her head, recalculating a route. "I'm really glad I came into the cafe that night," she said softly. "I almost talked myself out of it 4 separate times in the car." "I'm really glad you didn't," I told her. She held my gaze for a second, then checked her watch. "I should get back to the office. I have a review panel at 4. Barnaby's shift is over too." She patted the dog's head, and he gave a soft woof as if confirming he was ready for his union-mandated break. "But if you're ever going to be at another one of these public train wrecks, I will be," I said instantly. "The 15th, same room. They're discussing the dial illumination." She smiled, a real one this time. "Then I'll see you on the 15th, Julian." I watched her walk down the long corridor, Barnaby's claws clicking softly on the polished terrazzo floors. The sound echoed in the empty hallway. I just stood there, feeling this strange sensation that the gears of my life had just shifted into a completely different rhythm, a faster one. The 15th rolled around. When I walked into the committee room, she was already there, coffee in hand, sitting near the window with a fresh stack of documents and that same clicking pen. She looked up as I approached and said, "You actually showed up," which made me realize she'd probably had her doubts about whether a guy who buries himself in pocket watches would actually venture out into daylight twice for the same committee. I sat down right across from her. By now, it felt like a pattern we were building without ever having to say it out loud. A silent agreement. The meeting itself was about drainage infrastructure and foundation sealing around the tower base. Not exactly a topic that fills a room with warmth and excitement. It was dry, technical, and incredibly tedious. But Elena had done her homework in a way that made everyone else at the table look like they were winging it on a prayer. She asked these incredibly sharp, highly inconvenient questions The kind that make project managers squirm in their seats and look at their shoes because they actually require real, expensive answers. Watching her work, seeing the absolute clarity in her arguments, I couldn't help but think, man, she is terrifyingly good at what she does. She doesn't compromise on the foundation. Afterward, we ended up walking out of the building at the exact same time. It was mid-December by then, cold enough that our breath was freezing into little white clouds in the air. She was busy winding this massive knit scarf around her neck as we pushed through the heavy glass doors into the biting wind. I cleared my throat. Heading back to the office? Eventually, she said, squinting against the cold glare of the winter sun. I was going to grab something to eat first. My stomach has been growling since the drainage presentation. There was this heavy pause, the kind of pause that has a massive question mark hanging right in the middle of it, just waiting for someone to be brave enough to hit it. The lighthouse is 4 blocks from here, I muttered. She stopped on the top step and looked at me, her eyes amused, a tiny smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Are you asking me to dinner, Julian? I am pointing out the geographical proximity of a diner, I said with a straight face, keeping my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets. What you choose to do with that data is entirely up to you. She burst out laughing. It was that same face-changing laugh from 3 weeks ago. Wow, that is hands down the least romantic way anyone has ever suggested getting food. I'm a restorer, I said. We describe mechanical reality accurately. Emotion doesn't fix a loose mainspring. She shook her head, still grinning, and started walking down the icy sidewalk. Come on then, Mr. Accuracy. Let's see if your diner lives up to the data. We went to the old lighthouse. Clara took one look at us walking in together, the dog trailing behind, and she didn't even hesitate. She walked us straight to my usual booth without saying a single word. As she handed us the plastic menus, she gave me a glance that managed to communicate ultimate approval, complete vindication, and a silent "I told you so" all at once. I got my usual, black coffee and the chicken pot pie. Elena ordered a grilled cheese and a bowl of tomato soup, and Clara brought the food out with the kind of warp speed efficiency that suggested she wanted us to hurry up and fall in love so she could close up the kitchen early. We ended up talking for over 2 hours. The food got cold, the coffee got refilled 3 times, and the world outside just sort of faded into the background. It started with work, city politics, old blueprints, the nightmare of municipal budgets, but then it drifted into that deeper territory. The place conversations go when people finally stop being so damn careful and let their guard down. She told me about growing up in a tiny coastal town 3 hours north, being the oldest of 3. And how she was the only one who felt the need to leave the safety of the nest to see how things were built elsewhere. I told her about my dad's obsession with old mechanical junk, how he used to take apart lawnmowers and vintage radios right on the kitchen table, leaving oil stains on the linoleum, which is probably why I became a guy who couldn't look at a machine without wanting to see its heart. So it's his fault you're like this, she said, dipping a corner of her sandwich into the soup. Totally, I laughed. I literally can't walk into a room without listening for the ambient hum of whatever clocks are on the wall. It's like a sickness. What about this room? She asked, leaning forward. The wall clock over the kitchen is losing about 4 minutes a day. The balance wheel needs oiling, and the casing has a slight rattle. But the booth structure is fine. You're safe. She looked at me, her expression turning incredibly warm, almost tender in the dim light of the diner. Do you do that everywhere you go? Check if things are safe? Only in places where I actually care about things being stable, I said. The words came out before my brain could stop them. It was a complete structural error on my part. Total lack of torque control. She froze for a split second, her spoon hovering over the bowl. Then she looked down at her soup, and I watched this faint, beautiful color creep up into her cheeks. Neither of us said anything about it. We just let the comments sit there between the salt shaker and the napkin holder. But the energy in the booth shifted completely. It got quieter, heavier, but in a way that didn't feel uncomfortable at all. And neither of us tried to change the subject. The diner started emptying out around us, and we didn't even notice. The truckers left, the old couple by the register paid and went home, and Clara had stopped refilling our coffee hours ago, which was her subtle way of telling us the night was over. But she hadn't dropped off the check yet, which was her way of letting us stay as long as we needed. Eventually, Elena looked at her phone and gasped. It was past 9. She had an early morning site inspection at a crumbling retaining wall, and the drive back to her place was 20 minutes through the fog. She said it with that tone people use when they're desperately wishing a reality wasn't true. Outside, the winter air hit us like a wall, instantly clearing the warmth of the diner from our faces. She wrapped her scarf tighter, pulling it up over her chin, and we stood on the sidewalk next to her car. It was that classic, incredibly awkward moment at the end of a night where neither person wants to say goodbye, but nobody knows how to stay without looking ridiculous. "This is definitely not what I expected when I first walked into that diner weeks ago," she whispered, her voice muffled by the wool. "What did you expect? To say my piece, hand over a thank you note, and never see you again? To close the ledger?" She looked up at me through her bangs, her eyes catching the reflection of the street lamp. "I said thank you a long time ago, Julian." "You did," I said, taking a step into the cold space between us. "And then you stayed," she smiled, her breath blooming in the air like a small cloud. "And then I stayed." She got into her car, and I watched her drive away, her tires crunching on the thin layer of ice forming on the asphalt. I went back inside, paid the bill, and left Clara a tip that probably covered her groceries for the week. Because some things are just worth acknowledging, and Clara had played her part perfectly. By the time January turned into February, I had a permanent, low-grade awareness that my entire week had become a countdown to whatever day I got to see her. It didn't matter if it was a text about a broken gear on a historical town clock, or a quick 3-minute phone call about a budget meeting. But I was keeping things measured, professional but warm, present without pushing. I didn't want to mess up the timing. I've done that before in my 20s, moved way too fast on something that felt right, only to realize the foundation wasn't ready, and everything shattered under the weight of expectations. I wasn't gonna let that happen here. This felt too valuable to rush. We texted a lot during those dark winter weeks. It was mostly work stuff or pictures of old clock towers she found in city archives. But there was always this second layer underneath the words that neither of us dared to name. She'd send a picture of a horribly misaligned brick facade with the caption, "Someone didn't check their pivots," and I'd stare at my phone for 10 minutes smiling like an idiot in the middle of my dusty shop. Then came that public forum in late February. It was a massive town hall about a waterfront redevelopment project, and her mother's ex-husband, this bitter, loudmouth local developer, showed up. He stood up in front of 50 people and tried to publicly humiliate her, calling her structural assessments amateurish and claiming she was wasting taxpayer money on old junk. It was ugly, personal, and completely uncalled for. Elena just sat there, her spine perfectly straight, her face like stone, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But I could see her pen trembling in her hand. After it was over, I followed her out. I found her out by her car in the freezing cold, just staring off into the dark harbor, her hands deep in her pockets. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my distance so she didn't feel cornered or pitied. She looked at me, her eyes completely exhausted, the mask finally slipping. "He's been doing that for years. He shows up to things I build, things I preserve, and he tries to find the cracks. He hates that I succeeded after he left. I've mostly learned to just lock down my reactions, put up the storm shutters." "You handled it beautifully," I told her. "You made him look like a fool without saying a word." "I've had a lot of practice." She unlocked her car, the lights flashing once, then she paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. She turned back to me. "Can I ask you something, Julian? Something that's been bugging me?" "Anything. Why did you really write that letter for Elias? You barely knew him, he nearly ruined your business, and nobody would have blamed you if you just stayed out of it and let him deal with the consequences." I took a second to answer. The wind was whipping up from the water, freezing our cheeks, but I didn't want to rush this. I wanted to give her the raw, unpolished truth. Because his talent was real, I said, looking her straight in the eyes. And the reason he was fired didn't change the fact that he belonged at a workbench. Those two things existed whether anyone acknowledged them or not. He made a mistake, sure, but his core was good. I wanted to make sure the world didn't forget that. I wanted to make sure it was written down. She was quiet for a long time. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face, sticking to her lip, but she didn't move to fix it. "That's it," she whispered. "That's it." She looked at me with this expression that I finally recognized. It was the look of someone who had spent her whole life waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the hidden motive, suddenly realizing there was no other shoe. There was just a guy who did a decent thing because it was the right thing to do. "I think you are exactly who you appear to be, Julian Hayes," she said, her voice small against the wind. "And you have no idea how rare that is." I called her the next morning. No text, no safety net. A real phone call at 9 a.m. on a Friday. "I want to take you out," I said the second she picked up, before I could lose my nerve. "Not as colleagues, not after some municipal meeting, on purpose. To a nice restaurant on a Saturday night when neither of us has anywhere else to be. No blueprints allowed." There was a beat of silence on the line. Just a tiny one where my heart did a complete freefall. "Okay," she said. "Saturday? Saturday, pick you up at 7. That was the whole call. It was all we needed. The blueprint was drawn. We went to this upscale Italian place on the waterfront. The kind of place with white tablecloths and real candles. She wore this stunning dark blue dress that made her eyes look like the deep ocean, and her hair was completely down, cascading over her shoulders in soft waves. It struck me the exact same way it had that first night, like finally seeing the complete, unrestricted version of someone I'd only been allowed to view in glimpses through office windows and committee meetings. We talked until the staff started putting chairs on the tables around us and blowing out the candles at the empty booths. We talked about her time doing an exchange program in Portugal, my failed attempt at learning the cello in high school, the exact moment I realized I wanted to spend my life fixing old watches, just everything. The small, stupid details that make up a life. "Is that what you love about it?" she asked, leaning her chin on her hand, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. "The fact that you can fix what's broken? That you can control the outcome? It's more about the fact that if you pay enough attention, nothing is ever truly unfixable," I said. "Most people give up when a machine stops working. They throw it out. But you just have to find the one part that's holding up the rest of the mechanism. Usually, it just needs a little patience and some oil." She nodded slowly, looking at me across the table. "We're kind of in the same business, aren't we? We both spend our days making sure things don't fall apart under pressure. We just work on different scales." "Yeah," I smiled, reaching across the table to briefly touch her fingers. "I guess we are." We walked to her car afterwards. The night was freezing, the sky so clear you could see every single star over the black expanse of the ocean. She was walking half a step ahead of me, laughing about a ridiculous text message her brother Elias had sent her halfway through our dinner, and this sudden, massive wave of clarity hit me right in the chest. I did not want this walk to end. I didn't want to go back to my quiet apartment and my silent workshop. We reached her driver's side door, and she turned around to face me, her back against the glass. She had that look again, the one where she decided to stop being so damn careful and just let the mechanism run. "I have a confession," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that I could barely hear over the sound of the distant surf. "That first night in the diner, I had this whole speech prepared. It was supposed to be cold, professional, and quick. I was gonna hand you that envelope, tell you that you didn't erase the damage your shop did, and walk out. And then you were just you. You offered me coffee, you asked about my brother like you actually cared, and you made a stupid joke about the booth's structural integrity. I drove home that night furious at myself because I didn't stay and have that second cup." "You could have," I said, taking a step into her space, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her coat. I know, but I wasn't ready yet. My foundation wasn't set. Are you ready now? She looked up at me, her eyes shining in the dark. I think I've been ready for a while. I guess I was just checking to make sure the gears were perfectly aligned first. She used my own line against me. A perfect mechanical callback. I felt this massive, heavy weight in my chest that I'd been carrying for years just evaporate into the night air. The gears are aligned, Elena, I said. She smiled, that huge, beautiful, face-changing smile, and whispered, "Then stop checking them and do something about it." So I kissed her, right there on the pavement, under the freezing winter stars, with the smell of the salt ocean all around us, and she kissed me back with the absolute certainty of someone who was completely done overthinking, done measuring, and done keeping score. That was winter. By the time the summer rolled around, we had settled into something that felt permanent. Not because life stopped throwing things at us. We still had brutal budget meetings and stubborn contractors, but because the foundation we built was completely solid. It didn't shake. Our lives developed this beautiful, predictable shape. Tuesdays she'd come over to my apartment and we'd cook dinner, which always involved one of us being completely wrong about a recipe, burning the garlic, and both of us being totally fine with ordering a pizza instead. Saturdays we'd take Barnaby down to the dog beach, letting him chase waves until he was a wet, sandy, exhausted mess curled up on the back seat of my car. We got married the following spring. It was a small outdoor ceremony by the cliffs, right overlooking the water, maybe 30 people total. Elias walked her down the aisle, standing up so straight I thought he'd snap his spine, trying his absolute best not to cry in front of everyone and failing miserably. When he handed her hand to me, he gave me this tight, fierce handshake and just muttered, "Thank you, Julian." Barnaby sat right at the front row, wearing a tiny black bow tie that Elena had custom made for him, looking more dignified than any of the groomsmen. My dad gave a speech that included 3 different mechanical metaphors, a lot of hand gestures, and a 20-minute anecdote about an old grandfather clock he accidentally dropped down a flight of stairs in 1984 that somehow made half the room tear up. Elena definitely cried during the vows. I didn't, but man, it was a close call. My throat was so tight I could barely get the words out. During the reception, while the band was playing some old jazz standard, Clara from the old lighthouse pulled me aside near the bar. She had this look of ultimate, smug satisfaction on her face, holding a glass of cheap champagne like a trophy. "I knew it," she whispered, nudging my shoulder. "The exact second she sat down at your table. I told Pat in the kitchen that night, watch those two, they're the same kind of broken." "You literally scolded me for 15 minutes for not getting her number," I reminded her, laughing. Clara just shrugged, totally unbothered by the facts. "And you should have. You just got there eventually, kid. Some clocks just run a little slow." She wasn't wrong. There are nights now where I'm working late in the shop, the ambient ticking of 100 different clocks surrounding me like a mechanical heartbeat. And I think about how it all started. A letter I wrote on a rainy Sunday that nobody asked for, born out of nothing but a dislike for wasted talent. A woman who sat in a dark parking lot for 40 minutes in a cold car, trying to build up the nerve to walk into a diner. A stranger who sat across from me and told me she thought I knew why she was there. I didn't know, but I figured it out. And I think about the version of myself who used to sit in that corner booth every Wednesday night, eating alone, reading a technical manual, living a life that was perfectly orderly, completely precise, totally careful, and incredibly empty in the ways that careful lives always are. A clock that keeps perfect time but sits in an empty room doesn't really matter. I am so incredibly glad she walked in. I'm glad she sat down. I'm glad she said what she came to say, even if she had to fight through 2 years of anger to get it out. Because here is the thing about careful people, the ones who check everything twice, who measure before they cut, who never leave a single thing to chance, who think they can engineer away the risk of getting hurt. Sometimes the absolute best thing that can ever happen to them is for someone to walk into their life without an appointment, sit down right in front of them, and force them to look up from whatever they've been staring at, to break the glass casing. Not because being careful is wrong. The world needs people who check the foundations and oil the gears. But because the most beautiful things in this life are the ones you can never plan for. The ones that don't fit on a blueprint or a spec sheet. Some things just sit down right across from you. And if you're paying attention, if you're not too busy looking at the dust on the gears, if you're actually paying attention, you recognize them for exactly what they are. A perfect alignment.